Hello again, everyone. It's Mr. Most Days Off, and I am back again for another episode of the Best Darn Diddly Review Show. This week, we're going back with The Simpsons Season 1, Episodes 7 and 8, The Call of the Simpsons, and The Telltale Head. But I'm not going to be the only one yammering on about this show. As usual, we have your co-host with the most, Richie the Whiz Kid. How are you today, Rich?
I'm doing good for a Monday, sir. But as usual, I'll throw it back to you. The man, the myth, the Mr. Plow. It is Miles.
That's my name. It's not going to be just the two of us chatting about this episode. No. We have a very appropriate and very special guest to bring to you today. My good friend, Dr. Andrew Briseno. And yes, that is with the drunken hyphen over the end. How are you today, Andy?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. And for the record, that's our first, that's number one on our running Mexican joke count. Let's see how high we get by the end.
Hey, I'm not a racist. I'm going to make fun of you for being a Mexican and an Indian and just any other form of disability you have in you.
And that's why he's a doctor, ladies and gentlemen.
But yeah, Andy, welcome to the show, man. We're really glad to have you. Why don't you take a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us about your doctorate, and tell us about your connection with The Simpsons.
Sure. Well, I have a PhD in creative writing from the University of North Texas. I'm an assistant professor at Northwestern State University of Louisiana, Forkham Demons. And I think a lot and write a lot about fiction and stories and how they're put together. And I've also studied a lot of literature and stuff like that, which of course pertains a lot to The Simpsons in a lot of interesting ways. And like pretty much everyone else who's 30 through 35, like The Simpsons and me sort of grew up together. Like, I haven't done the math very recently, but I remember each of these episodes coming on the first time, and I really remember when they used to be on reruns on the WB33. And
yeah, definitely the WB.
Shout out, hashtag WB33. I just remember sort of really learning a lot about how stories are put together through watching The Simpsons and the way that they dealt with like similar ideas to other shows in interesting ways and sort of visited all of these common tropes of sitcoms in their own fashion. And of course, I'm really interested in The Simpsons because of the really interesting way that the show changes over time in history.
It kind of sounds like that you're saying The Simpsons helped direct you down the path that your life currently has taken.
Definitely watching a lot of TV is responsible for that. I don't know how many novelists are willing to admit I just watched a bunch of reruns and that taught me a lot. But I think that's totally true. Actually, just this week, I was teaching my graduate fiction seminar, what I like to call the theory of Scooby-Doo, which we probably do not have time to get into, / it gets really boring, honestly, for being about cartoons. Basically, yeah, the way that informs story structure, like both thinks about it and also creates it in weird ways. Like now we have an episodic structure to movies, and that's a direct relation to the way that television has changed our attention spans.
Huh, that's a really interesting point.
All right, so we've got a couple episodes to get to today. Let's go ahead and dive into the first one. Our first episode we'll be reviewing is The Call of the Simpsons. This aired all the way back on February 18th of 1990. As 90s as you can get, people. Opening up with this one, we have the chalkboard gag is I will not draw naked ladies in class. And our couch gag is interesting because they go to the non-gag gag awfully early for this, in my opinion, but nothing happens. They just kind of sit there as if something should. Also, fun for this episode, in the very early parts of this episode, we get our first appearance of Rod Flanders, and since this is primarily running on a wrestling program, I'm sure we have some United Kingdom's listeners out there. And this is the first ever episode to air in the United Kingdom. So just a little fun fact for you guys. But yeah, this is ultimately an episode where it's about keeping up with the Flanderses to start, and then it's just more of an adventure-heavy episode than really a comedy or heart-heavy episode. But Andy, what were your thoughts on this episode?
A lot of different things struck me. The reason I picked this episode to come on for was honestly one of the first things that happens, which is Homer and the salesman at the RV stand.
This is a really antiquated moment, is it not?
Oh, it so is, and yet I don't know. It's so beautifully done.
I agree, but like that part really stuck out to me because it's really common from sitcoms of this time period that they push the woman and children into the back and they have the man come doing the dealing, whereas this case, and often in sitcoms, the man is clearly the dumbest member of the family.
It's the Simpsons should always have Maggie do everything for them in relation to something like this. Maggie is by far the most adept Simpson at life.
She couldn't do worse than Homer.
Exactly.
That has to be true. Her credit has to be better.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's for the time frame though. It's perfect. It makes perfect sense with Homer. It's the normal American with terrible credit story. I love when that siren goes off.
That's a good sign, right?
The siren going off is never good.
Yeah. Mr. Simpson, are you aware of a good siren? It's amazing, for certain. And then the RV that they get, and it's like, literally, this is the RV for you. I mean, it's the only one you'll afford ever.
And then he falls for the oldest trick in the book of, oh, hey, that random guy over there is about to buy this if you don't. I'll take it, type of thing. And even puts the sleazy pressure on to not ask his family for help, which,
yeah,
that's the part that just baffles me. Going back to when he goes in the sales office and at this moment, like, I'm married, and I can't imagine buying anything. Like, I barely want to buy a pack of Tic Tacs without asking my wife for advice. Be like, hey, this isn't, like, dumb, right? I'm not getting ripped off over here, am I? Because, I mean...
Hey, Miles, what is the least amount of money you've ever checked a purchase with your wife? Man, you gotta understand, like, when Emily and I got married, we were fucking poor, so it was not a large number. Like, we were, I was working a shitty retail job, and she was a nanny, and those two things just did not pay very well at that time. So, I honestly, I can't remember an exact figure, but I know for certain it was less than $30. One time, my wife called me and sent me a text that said, "Is it okay if I have a chocolate bar?" And I'm like, "Wow, we are overmarried. Some line has been crossed." But in either case, returning to The Simpsons, you're totally right. And this is the first point at which a really interesting question to me comes up. What kind of tax bracket are The Simpsons in?
Oh, and in $1990 too.
Sure, definitely, because the price that Homer gets on this RV is $350 a month. And I mean, even if we're talking about like the equivalent of a buy here, pay here loan, like I really have to wonder about Homer's debt load vis-a-vis his income. I mean, what sort of a monthly income do you have to get before you'd get approved for a $350 recreational vehicle?
I was gonna say, in 2016 dollars, a new $350 payment would be fucking like not cool in my household. So I can't even imagine what this guy's pulling in. But he does work at a nuclear power plant, so you'd think he's doing all right for middle class America.
Although they established pretty early on in the episode that Homer is not so great with credit, because if you remember when Flanders pulls up with the RV, Homer makes the joke, which is actually my favorite thing in the episode, where he said, "I get your mail and you only make $27 more a week than I do." So clearly Flanders is way better at using his credit with the nice RV that he had, if you put it in those terms.
That's a really good point.
That is an excellent point.
And somewhat shocking that Flanders only makes $27 a week more than Homer, but again, he does work at a power plant. What does Ned do again? Do we ever figure that out?
He has the Leftorium, doesn't he? Or does he not have it yet?
He doesn't start the left-handed store until a couple of seasons from now. Before this point, it's entirely unclear what he does for a living.
Right on. Well, yeah, so the beginning of this episode is all about credit and really keeping up with the Flanderses, as Homer puts it, when they go RV shopping so they can go out into the great outdoors. Homer, claiming to be quite the woodsman throughout most of the episode, finds pretty quickly that he's not adept at getting himself to the campsite because they find themselves lost in the woods early on. And it's very clear that while trying to keep his pride in front of his family, Homer is pretty much fucked. And he's worried that he's killed his family. So the men take off into the woods to search for help, and the women stay back at camp, because they're useless according to 1990s TV. And neither parent realizes that the other doesn't realize that the baby is not with either of them, essentially. Marge thinks the baby's with Homer and Bart. Homer has no idea. So very early on, we find the Simpsons all separated, the men, the women, and the baby being raised by bears.
Again, being the most adept character.
She basically has bear slaves. I mean, they are like doing everything for her.
Yeah, I actually have a really weird deep theory concerning this that I think, honestly, more Simpsons episodes could bear out. I want you guys to think about this.
Nice phrasing there with the bear out.
Is it possible that Maggie Simpson is a muggle-born witch, a la Harry Potter, with the ability to speak to bears?
You just made my nerd boner stand up.
I'm going to say no, because you're not supposed to use your powers against muggles, and she definitely tries to kill Mr. Burns.
Well, hold on. I mean, like this is all before she gets called in, right? There are no penalties for your mistakes before you actually go to wizarding school, right?
Well, there are, but like not until you've been like you don't get in trouble for like doing magic before you're even aware that you're a witch.
Like when Harry talks to the snakes before he goes to Hogwarts, it's totally like nobody cares. It's not a big deal.
Well, I'll refer to you gentlemen on the Harry Potter stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I believe this episode, even though still predates Harry Potter, so but they are very, very close.
So
like,
you're saying that J.K. Rowling should say Simpsons did it?
Everyone else does.
As a literature scholar, the fact that they're not timeline-wise possible doesn't really bother me in terms of this theory. Maybe we could say that J.K. Rowling was inspired by Maggie to create Muggle-born witches. We don't know.
And she'll never admit it.
Maybe she actually is Hermione Granger. Let's think about that. Anyways.
Wow.
I don't know. I noticed it looks like Maggie has magic powers, and then I was like, she's talking to bears, and my mind put that together. And even in the next episode, and like throughout the rest of even this season, it seems like she really does have superpowers.
Man, I can guarantee you I'm going to be keeping my eyes open for this now. I haven't noticed, but that's a fascinating theory.
Very much so.
So moving on into this episode, we've got Homer the woodsman is essentially...
The experienced woodsman.
Yeah, the experienced woodsman.
They jam that down our throats like 15 times in the episode.
Don't worry, Marge. This is an all-terrain vehicle.
That floats, apparently.
Which, by the way, when Homer is driving over that, I made a note that it's the first time Homer doesn't use the map. Because he constantly, every time they take a trip, he's like, this is a shortcut. So this is the first instance where he's going to do this so many more times.
Also, I have to give props to that RV because it clearly forded a river, like Oregon Trail style, no problems.
And I don't even think a single ox died.
No, that's true. Not even one set of clothing.
Someone did get dysentery, I think, though.
Oh, almost definitely. That happens every damn time. But yeah, there is a moment here where after they run away from Maggie thinking it was a snake's rattle, that Homer is like, don't worry about it, boy. After you get to be an experienced woodsman, or like me, you just get a sense for these things, like a third sense. And then they push through a bush and fall off a ravine into a river.
A weirdly clothes-stripping river.
It does really just disintegrate clothing, doesn't it?
Fall right off.
Yes, our men of the family find themselves at the bottom of a waterfall, and as Andy already pointed out, they are in fact naked at this point, so they put a bush that has God knows how many insects in it over their genitalia so that we can safely watch the shows and not have it censored. And long story short, just so we speed through this part, Homer at one point gets the bright idea to try to eat honey out of a beehive. He gets stung in the mouth, so he can basically only make growling sounds. And as he's running away to find water to escape the bees, he just happens to wander into a creek where somebody is shooting some video of a deer. And he, of course, now falls in the mud, and when he stands back up, he looks exactly like Bigfoot. And now that science has obvious proof that Bigfoot exists, they're hunting for him to study him. They find the family, they find him, and scientists actually start to study him for a little while. And one of my favorite moments is when, from the previous episode, Dr. Marvin Monroe, that runs a family psychiatrist office, announces they announce that he's not quite sure if he's a human or an ape, and we get my favorite quote where science can agree this is either a below average human or an above average beast.
Well, Homer is like a buffoon, so that makes
brilliant
perfect sense.
beast.
I believe that's what Marge calls him at the end.
I think it's brilliant beast.
Oh, it could be both. Whatever.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, quote enough.
Interesting line for sure, and I love that somehow this gets Homer laid.
Right?
Oh, you're a below average human.
I actually made a note that with that, it's one of the first instances where you have like the bedroom scene with Homer and Marge, where her character is that like you're never quite sure why Marge always stays with Homer, but she's such a big supporter of him. And there's a lot of heart in the series from these moments, actually, whether it's good or bad. And this one's very, very brief and quick, but it kind of sets up those parameters for later on.
I think that's why I personally, and I'm sure others as well, it emotionally hurts when we get to these episodes coming up where they tease the idea that Marge and Homer would cheat on one another, and it's just like, oh man, but they're such so loving towards each other. That bums me out personally, but I totally agree. This is it does make you wonder, one, how Marge tolerates some of his buffoonery, and two, how being in a brilliant beast gives her a lady boner.
One of the interesting things in this episode I thought was the first newscaster that popped on and was telling the story of Bigfoot in the news. He sounded exactly like Kent Brockman but looked nothing like him. So we haven't had the first actual appearance of Kent Brockman yet. Again, it's like they're fleshing out who the characters are actually going to be a little bit still.
Definitely. Well, yeah. Andy, did you have anything else you wanted to talk about on the Call of the Simpsons?
Shout out to Marge's Grumble, which is just an amazing feature that by even this early is such an integral part of the show.
It says a lot with just a sound, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You totally know exactly what she means without saying a single
Kind of
word.
nagging sound.
Indeed, but that's all I've got on that one.
I didn't even talk about my theme for this episode. The theme for this episode for me was very clear. This was man versus nature. That's what this episode was about. Even when they're not in nature, even when it's Homer and the car salesman, it's man versus nature and the nature of the characters. And in literature as well, it seems like nature always gets the upper hand in the end.
Very cool. How about the Simpsons guide? Was there anything that we overlooked talking about?
Honestly, no. We touched on everything. All the things that it points out are what all the signs say, like when they have the Bigfoot stand set up, and there wasn't really a whole lot of interesting stuff. Honestly, in my opinion, this episode overall wasn't what I remembered it being. It was actually a little less fun than I remember. There's still great moments in it, but
it's more of an adventure than, like I said earlier, it's more of an adventure, and I think that's what spoke to me as a kid. And also, I remember having, I think it was Burger King did the toy line, or like the Happy Meal toys or whatever the Burger King Happy Meals. But Bart had like a backpack and like his skateboard, and Homer had like his fishing cap and stuff. And like I had these toys as a kid.
Those.
Yeah, they're great. I'll tweet out a picture of them for everyone so you'll see what the hell we're talking about. I bet it'll jog some memories. But so yeah, that's what I actually remember more than anything about this episode, is playing with the toys, and I think that's why I had such strong memories of the episode. But rewatching it, there wasn't a lot going on. I mean, in terms of there wasn't a ton of humor and there wasn't a ton of heart, which is so far what the Simpsons has presented each episode. But it did tell a really good story, and I did enjoy the adventurous side of things. But it was definitely a slower paced episode.
It reminds me of the video game, the arcade game, and that's also why I have a small fondness for the episode.
Totally. I was gonna say the bear is a villain.
Yes.
It is. He is the Bears. I'm going to talk about that in our next episode, though. Believe it or not, we'll go back to this. I promise. Our next episode was definitely a little faster paced. It was the Telltale Head, which is of course a play on Edgar Allan Poe's A Telltale Heart, and this episode had a lot happening. A lot more happening, I should say. First of all, let's start like we always do. The chalkboard gag on this one in the opening was, I did not see Elvis, though if you read, one of the lines actually said, I did see Elvis. And this one goes back to the Bart pops out couch gag, which I thought was interesting. That, again, I remember the couch gag always being a part of The Simpsons, and really so far it barely has been. They haven't really gotten too crazy with it, but it's season 1, so I'm sure that's going to change too. And as far as first appearances go, this episode had quite a few of them. We met Apu, Krusty the Clown, Sideshow Bob, Jimbo, Dolph and Kearney, the bullies, and Reverend Lovejoy, as well as a first mention of Jebediah Springfield. One other interesting thing about the bullies in this episode is Jimbo and Dolph's voice actors actually swap after this one, so I just thought that was kind of a fun fact. They're voiced by the opposite actor for just this episode. This episode's also told a little bit differently because it's told as a flashback. We start with the ending sequence of Bart and Homer rushing through town, being chased by a mob, carrying Jebediah Springfield's head, and then we flash back in time to see the story of Bart trying to win over his bullies. So he pulls the massive prank of cutting off the head and finds that nobody appreciates it, and it's just made him a villain to the town. But I'll go ahead and get to our little video game fun fact. When they first meet the bullies, it's because Bart is actually sneaking into the movie. I want to say it was like Revenge of the Space Mutants. Yeah. So if you looked when they're coming out of the video, the poster for this was actually the same design as the video game Mutant from the infamous NES game that's hard as fuck. So it's the one where in the first episode, or I'm sorry, the first level, which is what most of us is the only level that we ever played. Some of us were fortunate enough to get to level 2 and die in the mall instead of the schoolyard. But that's what the aliens look like, that you had to go around and spray paint purple or red or whatever it was. And I thought that was interesting that these episodes back-to-back make video game appearances. You guys already pointed out the bear was a villain in the arcade game, and the Space Mutants were the villain in the NES game.
That's outstanding.
I was going to say, I also like the flashback part where Bart projects how long the flashback story will take, and it's about the length of a Simpsons episode.
23 minutes, 5 seconds. 23:05.
Who has time for that? But yeah, Andy, we'll go ahead and start with you, man. What were your general thoughts on this episode?
I gotta start by talking about the church scene that warms this up at the beginning of the flashback, because there is so much insanity here.
Yes, there is.
Just starting with the lineup that Marge does with the kids. So first off, based on the compliment she gets, it seems that Maggie dresses herself. Hashtag Muggleborn Witch. And then it becomes important in a minute to point out that she gives Bart a complete pat down, right? And finds a comic book that he was going to bring with him.
Which, it's racist that she didn't pat down Lisa, too, I'm just saying.
She's not racist against her own children.
Outstanding.
I like the very first line in this episode, which was them running around the corner right before the flashback when Homer says, "When I was your age, I pulled a few boners."
That was a line so nice they did it twice.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was interesting when they do the pat down, and of course they find just about everything on Bart Simpson. But yeah, then I'll let you keep going because I want to hear more of your thoughts on the church scene. I know you've got more for us.
Well, of course, I love that it keeps getting more and more interesting. Like the car ride is really fascinating. But they get to church, and the first thing I want to point out immediately is that they're walking into church, and Bart has a Walkman with him, which really bothered
90s.
me. First off, shout out to Walkmans for sure. Like 90s nostalgia, very hardened in my heart. But he just got a severe pat down not 10 minutes ago, right? So
That's a smelly Walkman, is what you're saying.
did he seriously keister a Walkman? That's what I'm asking. Is that
He could have had it hidden in the car somewhere.
It's possible, and I want to hope for that, honestly. But it needs to be said.
See, I'm the opposite, actually, oddly enough.
Okay, that's
You expect
fair.
the worst in Bart every time.
That's totally fair. But I mean, I just want to, if you would pat down your son, wouldn't you check the back seat of the car? Like, what level of paranoia runs on top of which?
I thought you were about to say, if you pat down your son, wouldn't you check his back seat?
Oh no. In either case, then we get into the start of a lot of interesting philosophical questions that this brings up, because the Sunday school scene that they have working, where they're asking all of these really ridiculous questions about who does and doesn't get to go into heaven.
Yeah.
This was one of my favorite scenes in the whole episode.
It's so good.
It has one of my favorite lines, too. Or actually my favorite line. It's literally like at the end when Bart's asking that really long question to the teacher about like if a guy is really good but loses his leg because it becomes gangrene, does he get it when he goes back to heaven? And the Sunday school teacher says, "For the last time, Bart, yes."
See, I really appreciate when she just absolutely has her meltdown at the end and is just like, is it too much to ask for you to just have a little bit of blind faith?
For the record, I was never in Sunday school, but does Sunday school happen at the same time as the sermon? I thought it usually was after the sermon.
It depends on how old. I did go to a bit of Sunday school as a child back before, I was fixed. But regardless, they for depending on your age group, like for whenever you get to be older and you're like mature enough, I guess, to be able to sit through an entire sermon, it would typically, and also for adults, it would typically be Sunday school before, after the sermon. Typically before, because frankly, after a fucking sermon, everybody's just like, holy shit, let's get to the bar. It's Sunday, it's noon, and fucking football's on. What the fuck is wrong with that guy? He would not shut up. So they usually do it before, so everybody's nice and asleep and can be easily indoctrinated. And then you're released to go to the sermon, unless you're like a child, and then Sunday school kind of just lasts a really long time, but you almost always end up watching VeggieTales at one point, so, it's a nice balance.
Wait a minute here. I just had a thought. Football games usually start at 12, 3, and then the night game. This could help us figure out where the Simpsons actually live, because if Homer's listening to football on the way to church, normally the games start at 12 Central Time. So if Homer's going to church, you usually get to church sometime between, 9 and 12? So that would mean that they would have to be on the West Coast because there would be a 2-hour delay on the 12 o'clock start time.
Didn't they recently announce that the Simpsons, didn't they actually, announce where the Simpsons live?
They tried that.
Pat has a theory on this.
You have a
No, Matt
theory on
Pat.
that? Oh, Matt Pat. Dude, Matt Pat is fantastic. Shout out to Matt Pat, dude. Game theory is awesome.
He figures Washington, which incidentally agrees with what Richie is saying, because if you're on the West Coast, the football games start crazy early.
I have to say, though, on Smithsonian.com right now, it actually has that Matt Groening himself did, in fact, reveal where Springfield was.
Yeah, he announced it a while back. There's been numerous times, though, throughout history where they said it's literally nowhere, but recently he actually declared where it actually was supposed to be, but I don't trust it.
For what it's worth, it's Springfield, Oregon.
Yeah.
That's all right.
I think that's what Matt Pat said. I could have been wrong.
Yeah, I haven't watched that episode in a long while. Either way, all of that ties in.
That's all West Coast, baby?
It is all West Coast indeed. But yeah, so this episode after the church... one other thing on the church episode is Homer ends up listening to the football game during the sermon, and they do this great bit where Reverend Lovejoy is preaching about the dangers of gambling, which of course Homer has $50 riding on this game. And they start to do a thing where Reverend Lovejoy's actions and mouth line up with the commentary from the football game, and this just had me laughing my ass off. I thought that was brilliant, especially when they did like the touchdown thing and he throws his hand, or I think it was the kicking a field goal, and it was good, and Homer screams out, "It's good!" and just good stuff.
Just a quick side note from a personal standpoint, if you're ever at a bar and there's music playing and you can't hear any of the TVs, but they have like sports on TVs and you're watching during the commercials, this is a real thing that Homer just had happen with Lovejoy. Anytime there's a song playing, it looks like the commercials are playing to the song. Just a quick little tidbit there. So it could be drunken brain talking, but if you watch the commercials and you're listening to the song at the bar, they always match up perfectly every time. And also, I love the.
I'm sure that's science.
I love
scientific.
I love the radio broadcast when they pull up to the church where it says, "This is the best comeback since Lazarus rose from the dead." And Homer says, "Laza who?" And I just thought that was really funny considering they were literally going to church.
Exactly.
Definitely.
Is Reverend Lovejoy voiced by the same guy as the football announcer? Because it really sounds similar, which makes that even more funny.
Yeah, that would be. I don't know. We're going to have to check on that.
Yeah, that's going to be a hard one to even IMDb. I don't know. That's such a I don't know. Probably on that episode guide they have football announcer as a voice actor. We'll have to double check on that for sure. So the football game ends, and they pass by the movie theater where Bart sees that Space Mutants 4 is playing, and he wants to go, but his mother says no. Later in the episode, he asks Homer for money, assumingly so he can go to the movie, but when he's on his way, he runs into the three bullies that we mentioned, and they actually convince him to sneak in. which there was a really great line here that I appreciated that Bart basically said, but sneaking into a movie is practically stealing, to which the bullies replied, practically? It is stealing, man, come on. And Bart's just like, all right, I just wanted to make sure we weren't deluding ourselves.
Which gets back to this question of the moral relativism that was presented in church and throughout. Like when Homer asks on the ride home, Marge is like, the sermon was about gambling, maybe you should have been paying attention. And he's like, did it by chance say that under certain circumstances it was okay? And that's sort of the whole question of this episode, right? Is like, is there a situation in which doing bad is a good idea? And that comes up in several different moments.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. This episode was about
that's a really cool observation.
This episode was about peer pressure, obviously, which in one scene Homer is actually the worst at peer pressuring Bart into doing what he eventually does, which is why he's with Bart at the end. But I actually thought it was with the quote you talked about with Marge. I thought that was actually really funny because they haven't established this with Marge yet, but she's getting mad at Homer about gambling when Marge is the one in the family that has the gambling problem.
Right, we'll get to that in a much later episode, but you're totally right.
Yeah, although it does sound like when it first comes up that Homer has a gambling problem.
Yeah.
Because Marge says, you promised. And he says, it's not gambling, it's an iron pipe cinch or something like that. And it's like, wow.
This also kind of ties into Andy's thoughts on the first episode where we talked about what was their family income, because they just picked up a $350 a month bill on an RV, and he's already gambling $50 on a game. I mean, that's pretty steep odds. I would imagine $50 goes a long way in a family of three in middle class America.
No doubt, you could buy a week's groceries with $50 back then.
Back then.
Yeah.
And like furthermore, that $350, they're just setting that on fire every month because you got to presume that they didn't have an out clause if they drove their RV off the side of the cliff.
I was gonna say maybe they
that's
threw
not
some
covered.
bodies in there so that it looked like they actually died in there, and then they're not having to pay on it anymore.
Well, The Simpsons is an awfully generic name. You could just recreate yourself somewhere in a different Springfield
There you
each
go.
and every time.
See,
too.
this
Maybe
was
that's how they get
before
out of these things.
identity fraud was thought up. If only the Simpsons were more
totally.
ingenious criminally.
So you're saying The Simpsons did it?
Possibly. Points.
Miles, I thought you were about to go a Rick and Morty route and talk about a multiverse, and this is just a different universe.
Ooh, I love me some Rick and Morty.
Excellent.
But yeah, so this is where the story really starts to connect with the Telltale Heart, because Bart steals the head to impress the head of Jebediah Springfield to impress these bullies, and then whenever he learns that everybody is super pissed about this, the head starts talking to Bart, and he even acknowledges the fact that it's just his overactive imagination, but that still doesn't help stop the voice from telling him that he should do the right thing, and that, you don't just have to wrestle a bear to be a hero, you can also just tell the truth, and it gets it really starts to shadow this story in a lot of ways all the way up until the ending at this point.
It's just another example of smart writers at The Simpsons tying in a literary work, and I love it. Telltale Heart's great, so I love that they tie that in. I love that they tied in even The Godfather into this with the head in the bed when Bart woke up.
Yeah, that was cool. Andy, was there anything on a literary level that Richie and I may have missed connecting to the Telltale Heart?
Well, speaking of literature connections missed, it should bear noticing that the last episode also is a heavy literary reference. Call of the Simpsons.
The Call of the Wild,
yeah,
right?
Call of the Wild is a Jack London book, specifically about a dog who becomes a wolf again. And so Homer getting reconnected with nature in this standard way is sort of ridiculous.
No, that makes perfect sense, man. He becomes a monkey again.
Yeah, exactly. He returns to the wild and in much the same way. But other than that, I think this one is really pretty straightforward. We have the talking thing. We have him freaking out at the end and saying, and undoing it all. Other than, of course, the Telltale Heart doesn't have such a happy ending.
Well, I mean, after all, most lynch mobs aren't
great,
this
that is
nice.
great.
That is one of my favorite
That's
lines.
the last note I wrote down for this episode.
That was mine as well.
And I mean, it's just the casual, Simpsons.
Get back to formula.
Note it's storytelling, right? This story doesn't work without this mob, and yet the mob can't kill them. And it's that needs some note, or somehow you're just Yeah,
The
I love it.
thing I liked about how they
was really
resolved that
good.
actually is that Bart actually used religion to get out of the mob wanting to lynch him, which kind of goes back to the beginning of the episode, where he's like, "I'm just a young Sunday school student," and they immediately turn their heads and they're like, "We can't do this."
Yeah, it's good. That's a good call. Again, that goes back to just how clever the writing is on all of this, on all these episodes.
Which, particularly since, Bart's religious affiliation is questionable at best up to this point. Like, it's clearly just sort of he's using this to avoid dying.
It's kind of like if you've seen the movie War Dogs, the character that Jonah Hill plays in that movie just constantly he's kind of just a sleazy bastard, and he constantly morphs himself into the person that he knows the person he's dealing with wants him to be. So like in the movie, like at one point he carries a yarmulke around, and like he'll flip into being Jewish, he'll flip into being a good Christian man, and it's totally the same type of concept on a little bit smaller level for Bart Simpson at age 10.
If you don't know what he's talking about, I think there's some movie review YouTube channel you can check out and see what the movie's about.
Yeah, we apologize for how long that one is in advance. That was before we revamped the program, but it's worth listening to.
I was going to throw in one thing that I thought, again, because we talk about reflecting back on these episodes and how society was back then, where now there's things that we see that don't bother us in the episodes, but back then they were a really big deal. You see Bart's ass in this episode. And I was thinking, I don't know how many times you've seen
True.
naked child body parts on a cartoon show before this point in the world.
Oh, that's interesting.
I didn't think about that either, but I love that scene in the movie, the Simpsons movie, which we'll one day we'll get to that too. But when with the Simpsons movie, there's a great scene where they're using all these like natural scene placements, their set placements to block his penis basically, and then at one point, like after it's built up to all these blockages, they just straight up show it as he skateboards by a fence, and there's just like a board missing, and it's fucking hilarious.
Yeah, totally. Also, this points out a slightly interesting point. So Bart, he's walking, he takes off his Sunday school like shirt and coat, he musses up his hair, he slides off his shorts, and then he's wearing other shorts, which implies, is Bart going commando?
Ooh.
Is there no underwear in The Simpsons?
Or he just has the underwear set in his shorts.
Well, we
and
know
he's
Homer wears
so
them.
dirty and nasty that he's like, I'll rewear this underwear.
Well, I mean, maybe, but he doesn't. Then you would keep the underwear on, right? Like when I change pants and not underwear, I'm not ever briefly naked.
But I think it was just more of a. I like to think Bart is going commando all the time. I think that makes more sense for the character, but it plays into the shedding off the religious part and going back into the bad boy part.
Right on. So, Andy, do you have anything else that you would like to bring up on this episode?
Just to kind of close down back with the idea of moral relativism in all the ways it shows up, right? Because is it okay to cut the head off this statue if it's going to give you a certain social stance? Well, no, it's not. Maybe yes, it is. But even in the end, with Bart faking religion, right? It's okay to fake religion if it keeps you from getting lynched.
I actually think that's that one might actually be the most true one of all.
That's a dark, fucked up thought.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that saved him. Like, that's just ridiculous, but I love it.
Going back to Rick and Morty, if I find myself in a universe or a planet that's like, if you don't believe in this religion, we will kill you, I'll be like, hail whoever the fuck you said.
Peace among worlds.
What was the name of my eternal creator again, so I can start praising him more accurately?
Right. What about you, Rich? Anything else from you or your guidebook that you'd like to point out for this episode?
Just that what I was getting back to earlier about how, for me, this episode was a lot about peer pressure, especially with the bullies saying it would be cool for the head to get cut off, but as soon as it happens, they're like, that was just cloud talk, man. But I said earlier that Homer was actually the worst person at peer pressure in this episode, because he's the one that actually pushes Bart over the edge to cut the head off, and that's kind of dark as well, considering it's his father, but he says that being popular is the most important thing. And then even Homer is like, I can't believe you did this, even though he knew it had to be you, pretty much. But just the whole thing in general, man, about peer pressure, and that even with a historical figure, nobody really wants you to do it, but you got to learn the difference between right and wrong, and this is an early lesson for Bart.
One that he totally does not like that he completely unlearns as soon as like an episode or two later. But
He
in
can't learn
service
it.
of fiction, what are you going to do in life, right?
We wouldn't have 27, 28 seasons if he ever learned a lesson.
Still can't believe we're in 28 this September.
That's disturbing. It truly is. I mean, I know The Simpsons is essentially as old as me and probably exactly as old as one of you.
I happen to have a birthday in September. I'll be turning 31 this year, but I'm within a couple of years of The Simpsons.
Stupendous. Terrifying.
Terrifyingly, but still going strong, and that's awesome.
By
But
the way,
yeah.
was that comic book that Bart had at the beginning? Was that the first Radioactive Man appearance?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I did not find that online in the notes, but that very well could have been overlooked. We'll have to dive more into that as
That
well.
was actually the stuff you may have missed. They said it was a Radioactive Man comic, and I didn't catch that. I wasn't paying enough attention.
I actually did. I just didn't think about the fact that that may have been the first appearance. I wonder. Oh no, we have. That was the gun supply shop. I was thinking we'd already met the comic book store already as well, but we have not yet. So that very well could be. All right, well, I think, guys, that's all we have to say about these two episodes. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Best Darn Diddly Review Show. We do have a couple more episodes coming for you next week. Interestingly enough, they both deal with marital infidelity. We've got Life on the Fast Lane and Homer's Night Out. So we're excited to get back and talk to you about those. Before we call it quits today, Andy, is there anything that you would like to plug?
No, I'm good.
Awesome. And Richie, how about yourself?
Well, as always, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at thewiz_kid23. Also, Mr. Most Days Off and myself do a weekly movie review show on YouTube that we've alluded to, more than alluded to a few times, but just go over to YouTube and subscribe to Mr. Most Days Off and check our weekly reviews. We're always going to the movies.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. That's on my YouTube channel, which is Mr. Most Days Off. I'm also on Twitter at Mr. Most Days Off, and you can follow this show on Twitter at Best Darn Diddly, as well as the movie review that Richie just mentioned. I also do a weekly WWE Cruiserweight Classic review each and every Wednesday night. We only have a few weeks of that left. We're about to be in the finals. And starting on September 7th as well, for you wrestling fans, Lucha of the Hidden Temple is coming back. That's our weekly Lucha Underground review. And we also do Legends of the Hidden Temple runs reviews. So, come for either of those. They're a blast. As always, I would love to send a special thank you out to Steve the Fan from thefanspodcast.com. He's the one that was the brainchild behind this program and gave us the opportunity to come on this show and talk about one of the greatest television sitcoms of all time. And also, I would like to thank Andy, Dr. Andrew Briseno, for coming on our show today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, my friend. I hope you had fun talking about The Simpsons with us, and I hope you'll come back and do it again sometime.
Absolutely, man. It was a great time, and I'd like you to know that you cost me $5 because I bet the over on 5 Mexican jokes with my wife, Emily. So thanks a lot, asshole.
I could squeeze a couple in real quick.
It's not too late.
No, I was just going to go hire some Mexicans to do it because they get that
4.
shit done fast.
One more, come on.
Man, it's been a pleasure. We look forward to having you back.
100%, man. Absolutely fun.
Other than that, we look forward to seeing you again next week for the Best Darn Diddly Review Show.